Hello and welcome to yesterday's Airlines once again for another review release ranking video. And this time around it's geminijets who've just announced their August announcements, which will appear in September if you're lucky, and maybe a bit later if in the UK, since it seems to take forever for Gemini models to get here. But Gemini had a good year so far, I think. Just looking back through models that I've bought this year, and I've actually picked up 4 Geminis already, which is a high number for me, to be honest, because gone are the days when there were, say, 20 releases that I'd be interested in from Gemini a year. Looking back, that was in the 2008 period. If I look back through my collection, this is before I was collecting actually, but if I look by models by year, then I was picking up, or I've picked up between 19 and 25 models most years up until 2008, and then after that it kind of tails off as Gemini release a less diverse set and a more modern set, I guess, as well. But anyway, it has been a good year. 4 models bought so far, with the TAM F100 on the way for number 5. And last month we had quite an interesting set, didn't we? A couple of MD-80s, and for me, that Air China Cargo 747. So, you know, I could almost feasibly get near 10 Geminis this year, which would be quite amazing. So, well done, Gemini. You've made some interesting models this year. But it can't be that way every month. And this month, I think, is perhaps not as exciting as the months we've just been getting. So, it'll be interesting to see whether you guys agree or not. Before we get into the video in detail, don't forget, though, to subscribe to the channel. And I really appreciate those that have, and thank you very much for watching. But if you enjoy the content here, then please subscribe. And don't forget to also follow me on Instagram at YesToAirlines and over on Facebook. And obviously, keep on checking out the website, yesterdaysairlines.com, where a huge amount of content is published very regularly. And I will almost certainly be giving that Gemini F100 a look over with a detailed review in the next couple of weeks. But okay, that's enough of that. Let's get into the video and check out what Gemini have got on offer for us this month. So getting on into the releases, and it's a fairly standard sized Gemini month, i.e. it's not particularly large. It makes these videos a lot easier. In fact, this month there are only 8 non-max releases, and there is a max release as well. I think it's a C17. I'm not even going to talk about it because they all look the same. But there are 8 completely independent models to discuss. One of them comes in flaps down as well, so I guess you could count there being 9, but we'll just treat it as 8 and assume I'll point out where the flaps down model is. And as always, start with the Airbuses moving to the Boeings. And that means we'll be going to begin this month with a British Airways A321neo. It's registered GNEOR. Not particularly exciting, if I'm honest. When you look at what has been made here for BA Neos, there have been a few, but not as many as you might think. There have really only been models made previously by Panda Models, who've made 2, this Reg and NEOP, and also Gemini, who've made NEOP themselves before. And that means that you've got a pretty good idea what this release is going to end up looking like. And anyone who's overly familiar with the jcwings Gemini A321neo or A320neo kind of knows what they're getting. You're getting not the best mold in the universe. There have been some improvements made to the nose, but when I look at the old release here, you've got the chunky landing gear, which is a bit short. You've got oversized aerials. You've got not particularly well formed nose. I'm not sure the cockpit's particularly well printed on the old release either. But most of all, you've got these big engines, which are just too big. I know the Neo's got big engines, but they ain't that big. So it's not a great mold. And when you compare to the Panda versions, which, you know, just look great, then there's really no competition, frankly. The mold there is so much better. The only problem obviously may be that it's probably quite difficult to find the Panda versions now. there. These were released, I think, 2019, something like that. So it's the first one in a while. And in fact, the BA version was made in 2019. So the Gemini version was made in 2019. So they all made them in 2019. This model probably made in 2019 as well, to be fair. And it's just been sitting in the factory for the last 4 years. But yeah, not going to be a great model. So I'm just going to put this one up there, or down there, should I say, into gas guzzler. It's really hard not to gas guzzler any Neos coming out of the jcwings Gemini stable, which is a shame. Next up, we've got, hey, Emirates, but hey, Emirates, it's an A380 A6 EOG. And the reason I say, hey, Emirates, and sound vaguely excited by it is because it's in the new livery. Now, regardless of whether you like or dislike the new livery, and to be honest, I'm a bit ambivalent about it, nobody else has made it. Nobody else is likely to make it. Gemini do have this stranglehold on Emirates, which I'm surprised at a little, because every other airline, even the ones that are quite litigious, like Cathay, still get models made for them in 400 scale by others, but nobody in recent years has tried to topple the monopoly that Gemini has here. That is unfortunate, because obviously this is the weakest A380 mold on or in the scale. And when you do look back, there have been A380s historically made by other brands. Phoenix has made one or two, Magic Models, wittywings, so we're talking a long time ago now, we're talking 2013 or so, but there have been A380s made by other brands, and if you look back even further, there have been Dragons and such. So there have been other Emirates A380s, but not for years and years, and of the 50 odd Emirates A380s that have been made, you know, a good 40 or plus of them probably have been made by Gemini in various different special schemes. So the good thing about this is that it's unique, no one else has made it and or is likely to make it. The bad thing obviously is the mould isn't quite as good as you'd hope. It's not a complete train wreck though. I've previously owned some jcwings A380s and I didn't think they were dreadful, but they're just not as good as the Phoenix and certainly not as good as the Aviation 400. Nonetheless, I think that I'm going to put this one in the high flyer because it's a new scheme and no one else has made it, and the mould isn't horrible. I'll put it in the high flyer, which perhaps is a little generous, but hey, generous guy. However, my generosity has limits, and the next model up is a Southwest Airlines 737-800 in the Tennessee 1 colours. And to be honest, this month's Geminis look very much like previous month's NGs, which is not a good thing because they often don't look as good by comparison, and this one certainly doesn't, because like their A320neo, their 737-800 mould is old and inferior, and it does not pay or bear any comparison to the NG models version of this exact scheme, which has already been made just recently. So do we need this model? It's N8620H, that's the reg, but obviously it's wearing Tennessee 1 scheme, so it's exactly the same reg and scheme as the NG version, which I would have thought most people would have got. And this must really annoy Gemini because they put it in this model a while ago, and NG have gazumped them effectively here with this one. But yeah, it's a shame. It's a shame that Gemini persist in releasing models that everyone knows are weaker than the competitions that are exactly in competition with them. So I don't really understand it, but I guess Geminis are sold more widely than NG at the moment, and there will be people buying this still, but it'd be a bit crazy to really buy this when you could get the NG version on such a superior mould. And this mould, again, like the A320neos, find it very hard not to just slap it straight in the gas guzzler. Next up, we've got a couple of 767 MAX 8s, and these ones are much better than the 800 because the Gemini MAX 8 mould is good. Really nice, actually, and these would both be getting better scores if, again, they hadn't already been made by NG Models. In fact, they've now announced 3 Bonza 737 MAX 8s. So, don't really need another one by Gemini. And similarly, they've announced and released the Qatar version as well. So again, don't really need the Gemini version. But it's a good mould. Maybe not quite as good as the NG. I don't know. They're both pretty good. There's not a lot between them, I would say. So, you know, get one or the other. Doesn't really matter too much. But again, I would expect that if you were paying attention and interested that much in 400 scale models, you would have probably got one of the NG versions of either of these if you wanted them. So, yeah, takes the shine off them somewhat. And I'm going to put them both in the workhorse for that reason. Nothing really exciting to see there. Okay, and that brings us into more Emirates in the new scheme. But it's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing, especially not in this case. There are still moulds which Gemini has access to, newer moulds like this one for the 777-300ER, which are exceptional. jcwings has done really good work making this mould, and they also make it in flaps down, and this model will come in flaps down too. So we've got here A6ENV wearing the new Emirates livery on the 777-300ER on the JC mould, which is really nice. No one else has made it. Again, no one else is likely to make it. And in this case, no one else needs to, because Gemini have got the best mould for it. So this one's looking pretty damn fine to my eyes. And in fact, so far I'm going to put in supersonic. Fast forward a couple of years and when they've released multiple of these, and maybe I won't be so complimentary about it, but for now, this is a really good model and a nice release. Okay, that takes us out of the standard Boeings, and in fact I'm going to drop next to a CRJ200. This one's in the colours of, or the retro colours of Air Wisconsin, which had a really nice scheme in the 80s before it got sucked up in all the express liveries, and is a regional airline with a really long history, really interesting history as well, one worth exploring. In fact, I've written about them at the website, so check out that Av History blog for Air Wisconsin. But here we've got the retro CRJ wearing that lovely old scheme. It's registered N471 Zulu Whiskey, and yeah, this should be a nice release too. And the only problem here is that once again, the mould is really weak. And you have to say that when you look around a lot of the regional jet moulds that are being used by jcwings Gemini, they're quite old and they're showing their age and they don't look particularly good. They've got the same sort of issues with their ERJ145s. They've got similar issues with some of the larger E-jets too. It's only really the larger CRJs that look pretty good. And this smaller CRJ200, not a great mould. I've got a few, only a couple. I've got the old United Express Air Wisconsin one, the Bachelor Grey. Colours that were awful on that, but I'm talking about the mould here. I also just recently actually picked up a Shanghai Airlines version. But you have to accept that the mould isn't very good. I know it's small, it's at the scale, it's small, but it definitely could be a lot better. It's a mould that probably should be junked and rebuilt. Or maybe it's just the case that aircraft that are small as CRJ really only work in 200 scale. Don't know, but it's not a great mould. Having said that, I'm sure it's going to be super popular, this release, and I know that regional aircraft seem to be pretty popular amongst collectors, so I would expect it to sell well. And it's just like the old retro scheme, I can't bring myself to be too upset by the fact that the mould isn't very good for this one. You know, from a mould perspective, it's probably a gas guzzler, but from a livery perspective, it's like a high flyer. And so I'm going to even this out, I think, and put it in workhorse. It should be nice, but you're going to have to ignore the mould, and potentially also on these small models, QC issues as well. So yeah, I'm willing to be proven wrong. Maybe it'll look great, but I get the feeling this one is just going to be workhorse. And that brings us to our last release from Gemini this month, and that is a US Air Force 747, the VC-25A, the Air Force One. The registry is 82-8000, and the difference between this release and the release which Gemini did quite a few years ago now in 2016 is that the aerial configuration has changed. In fact, it seems, looking at pictures, the primary difference is the number of domes across the top. The aerials themselves look like they're mostly similar, but it's got these 3 sizable domes on the rooftop, so it is different. It is nice that Gemini have gone the distance on this mold and put a lot of effort into it. Looking at the previous release, it's got different horizontal stabilizers, for example, and it's got all the extra aerials, and it looks really good. It is tacked onto the old Gemini 747-200 with the seam and the quite chunky engine pylon to wing joint, but it's not dreadful by any margin, and the last release looked really good. Hey, I'm not American. I don't worship the US president, so I'm not remotely interested in this model, but I can see that lots of people will. So, yeah, core straight into the Gemini marketplace, really, isn't it? This one. Yeah, this will be a nice model. Gemini are going to do a good job, I'm sure, with this one. If it looks as good as the 2016 release, but with the extra domes and things, I'm sure it'll be a really nice model, and the two together should be a good pair. So, yeah, I can't damn this one at all. I think it'll be nice. And it still would be quite nice to see the 747 version of this model get more usage from Gemini. But I'm going to put this one up in the high flyer alongside the other Emirates. And that kind of sums up this month's release set, in a sense. You couldn't get a much more Gemini release set. BA, Southwest, Emirates, a bit of US Air Force. It's so Gemini. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but they are still trying to compete against superior competitors' molds, and that surely can't last forever. The BA, the Southwest, arguably the Maxes too. Those models, yeah, they're just not really needed, and they could be doing other things, I feel, but hey, it's their choice. It is perhaps a Gemini thing that the 2 high scoring models this month for me are the Emirates. It's not often I would say that, but this month I think that is the case. So, nowhere near as interesting as the last few months. I don't think any of these models are going to be joining my collection because they don't fit my criteria, or the molds aren't good enough. But I'm sure amongst Gemini's core collectorate, they'll sell. So that's all that really matters to Gemini, I imagine. So that's it from me for this month's Gemini release announcements. Thanks very much for watching and listening. I really appreciate it. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you next time from yesterday's Airlines. See you later.